Hi team, Raphael here with Ask Me Anything for the 28th of August. The first question comes from Tracy, and it's a follow-on question to something that I answered last week about the action of actin and myosin inside muscle fibres and the physiological mechanism of how muscles contract. So if you want more background, go back to last week's episode and watch that one. Tracy says, when a muscle is chronically contracted and we have knots in the muscle, does that mean that the actin and myosin filaments get locked together? What causes knots, and how does massage or myofascial release these adhesions or stubborn contractions? Thanks again. Hope all is well in Melbourne. Yeah, everything's pretty awesome here with me at the moment, Tracy. Thanks for asking. There are actually a number of assumptions behind this question which turn out to not be correct. So it's commonly supposed that we get painful knots in our muscles. Sometimes they're called trigger points, sometimes they're called knots, sometimes they're called tender points, and that these are, local contractions of the muscle, and that they can be released by dry needling or massage or rolling on a ball or something. And indeed, when you have a sore spot in your neck or your hip or something, often if you palpate it, you can feel a kind of a taut band of muscle in there. And when you rub on it, it hurts like anything. And then after you rub on it for a bit, it feels better. So that hypothesis does, at face value, seem to fit the facts. The hypothesis being that there's a local contraction or knot, within the muscle, and that you can release that by pressing on it. However, this phenomenon has been pretty extensively researched now, and it's failed to really stand up to that research. So there are several lines of evidence here that I'd like to share with you. The first one, well, basically two big areas. The first one is experimental studies that try and locate trigger points or knots within muscles have essentially failed to do so. And the second one is when we look at intervention studies that look at, pressing on or injecting things into or dry needling of these trigger points or muscle knots, those studies essentially have, show very minimal benefit, if any, beyond placebo of that treatment. So let me explain in a little bit more detail. So firstly, let's look at or think about some of the research in relation to, finding trigger points or muscle knots. So it is true that when you palpate, a sore muscle, often you can feel a kind of a tight spot or a knot or a taut band under your fingers. However, when we look at these in controlled experiments, several things sort of become clearer. The first one is that when you press on a muscle, there's something called the myotatic reflex, which basically causes the muscle to contract due to the pressure. So it's really a case of if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound, because if you're not palpating, well, the taut band could well not be there because it might be an artifact of the palpation. So in other words, the palpation, feeling for the taut band, causes the taut band. So that might be one thing. The second thing is that when we, in studies where they get physiotherapists or, medical people to palpate patients and, feel with their hands and try and feel where these taut bands are, where the trigger points are, when the treating health professional knows, this person's got pain here, then they feel, and they go, oh yeah, I can feel the taut band, it's right there. But when they're blinded as to whether the person has pain or not, so in other words, they have a whole bunch of people with neck pain, a bunch of people with no neck pain, and the treating medical people have to find the taut bands. It turns out that they basically can't identify them better than a coin flip when they don't know, where the pain is. So they can find taut bands, but they find very different ones. So one study I saw, there was a difference in the upper trapezius muscle, which goes from here to here. Like it's a muscle that's probably, 15 centimetres long. And there was up to 6.5 centimetres difference in where the experienced practitioners found these trigger points or taut bands in this particular study. So, it's just the margin of error is essentially the size of the universe on that one. Now, another phenomenon that is associated with these knots is that when you poke on them, if you have a sore spot, sometimes when you poke on it, the pain radiates to somewhere else. Like if you press on your neck, it might radiate up to your head or down to your shoulder or something. And the interesting thing about this is that it's not just pain that radiates; it's actually pain sensitivity that radiates, or tenderness that radiates. So if you have a painful spot, on your neck somewhere, well, that can radiate pain down to your shoulder sometimes if you press on it. But also what you'll find is that the shoulder is more tender in that instance where there's a radiated pain. There's often also a radiated hypersensitivity. So, and this can be the case in situations where people have, nerve irritation in their low back and their nerve pain, there's nerve-generated pain or sciatica going down the leg. Well, actually, the leg can be super sensitive, like really tender and unpleasant, painful for the person if you touch it. And it's not because there's something wrong in the leg; it's because the nerve that innervates the leg is irritated. And so that's that line of experimental evidence. The increased sensitivity in the like the radiation from the referral from these trigger points or knots, or supposed trigger points or knots, suggests, more plausibly some kind of neural irritation rather than a muscle knot, as it were. When we inject, another line of evidence, when we inject Botox, botulinum toxin A, I think it's called, which basically paralyzes the muscle. When we inject Botox into trigger points, it doesn't reduce the pain, although it does eliminate the muscle activity that's happening. So that, that kind of pulls apart, that disconnects the idea of the muscle tension from the pain, because we can actually eliminate the muscle tension by injecting Botox, but that doesn't eliminate the pain. So if we can eliminate the muscle tension and the pain remains, well, the muscle tension probably wasn't causing the pain. What else have I got in my notes here? Oh, yeah. Studies using ultrasound, MRI and electromyography, so sticking needles into the muscle and measuring the electrical impulse from the muscle, have really failed to detect trigger points, for a number of reasons. And for example, when you do electromyography on someone, you stick a needle into their muscle to measure the electrical activity. Well, that's not just a passive measurement, that's an actual, you're sticking a needle into the muscle, and that can evoke the myotatic reflex. If you stick a needle into a muscle, it can cause the muscle to fire. And so, that inherently confounds the results of these studies. So, we're trying to detect muscles firing, and we cause them to fire by the detection process. Kind of like what we said at the start, when you press on a muscle, it causes that myotatic reflex. With ultrasound, we can image muscles, and sometimes we can detect areas where the muscle's contracted, but then hard to connect those areas where the muscle's contracted with areas where the patient feels symptom. Finally, the last line of evidence is that in terms of experimental pathophysiology, is that we find that people who have, so there are supposed to be two forms of trigger point, muscle knot. One is called active and the other one's called latent. And the active trigger points or knots are ones that are actively painful. So you see the thing, gee, my neck hurts, or gee, my back hurts. And, there's a kind of a throb or an ache or whatever from that spot. And then when you press on that spot, it's even more painful. It's very tender and sensitive to touch, and often it radiates to somewhere else. And then there's the latent trigger points, which are not painful. You're walking around happy as Larry, not able to feel any discomfort. But when you press on them, that's really sore. So the latent ones are said to be, knots that are in there as well. But the problem with that hypothesis is that when we examine, palpate, poke people who have active trigger points, we find that they have also latent trigger points in other areas of their body. And then when we find people who have no active trigger points, have no muscular pain ever, they also have latent trigger points in just as many parts of their body. So the latent trigger points seem to be basically everyone has it. If you press in this spot in your neck or just under your head here or in certain places in your lower back, everyone's going to feel that as tender. And then when we actually look at pro-inflammatory chemicals and things so the idea is that the knot in the muscle is contracted, and that prevents adequate blood flow to the muscle because it collapses the capillaries, the smallest blood vessels, and prevents oxygenation of the muscle. So the muscle undergoes oxygen starvation, essentially. It's called ischemia. And then the muscle releases inflammatory chemicals, and that causes the irritation, and which perpetuates the muscle contraction. So that's kind of the theory. But what we find is, so when we actually do muscle biopsies of trigger points or muscle knots, we find pro-inflammatory chemicals there. But then when we do muscle biopsies of the same person, but in a completely different muscle, so maybe if they've got a sore neck, we biopsy their calf muscle that's not sore, or their quad muscle or something that's not sore, we find the exact same level of inflammatory markers in that uninvolved muscle, that asymptomatic muscle. And so what that says is that those in these people for whom they have these active trigger points, so-called, actually it's probably more of a systemic situation of inflammation, and we find that they have increased pressure pain sensitivity and so on, and other forms of pain sensitivity. So it's probably more of a central nervous system processing, or possibly more of a central nervous system processing issue combined with maybe a neural inflammation. And finally, the last line of evidence is actually experimental studies on interventions. So when we get a bunch of people who have pain, chronic muscle pain, and we dry needle them, or we massage them, or we inject anaesthetic into their trigger points or whatever, what we find is basically these interventions have essentially no benefit beyond placebo. So when we do sham dry needling, for example, it's basically just as good as real dry needling. And all of these interventions, so whether you're pressing on a sore spot or whether you're sticking a needle in it, all of these interventions have a common theme, which is they all cause pain, right? If you stick a needle in, that hurts. If you press on somewhere that's sore, that hurts as well. And so basically another theory that might explain this is you basically cause a competing, more painful stimulus, and that essentially drowns out the original pain. And, drowns out is not quite the right word, but basically either through central nervous system descending nociceptive inhibition or /and through pain gating, which I won't go into the explanation of right now, but basically your brain can't process two different pains in the same area at the same time. So you can't have, you can have a dull throbbing ache and you can have a sharp searing pain, but you can't have both in the same body part at the same time. So if you've got a dull throbbing ache there and I stick a needle in you, well, now you've got a sharp searing pain, so you can't feel the dull throbbing ache anymore. And when you take the pin out, even though the sharp searing ache is gone, your brain's kind of been distracted from that a little bit, and so you don't notice the throbbing pain there for a while. So that's how massage or soft myofascial release or dry needling could alleviate those symptoms temporarily. So we're left with these phenomena that people have, when you palpate, you can feel taut bands in there, and then when you press and they have a pain, and then when you press on there for a while and it hurts, the muscle feels like it relaxes. Well, what happens is when you increase the pain, that tends to decrease the muscle activity. So you press on it and you cause it to become taut because you've evoked the myotatic reflex, and then you cause some pain, and that pain tends to relax the muscle and you feel it relax and you're like, oh, that's feeling good. And then you take your hand away and they're like, oh, that feels a lot better. And so an alternative explanation that doesn't have yet strong experimental support, I have to tell you, but is more plausible and, more importantly, has not been disproved like trigger points have. An alternative hypothesis, and probably the best working hypothesis that we have at the moment, is that people have pain of unknown origin in their muscles, possibly central nervous system related or related to inflammation / irritation of peripheral nerves. And when you palpate, that palpation causes the myotatic reflex to evoke a taut band, a knot. So the act of palpation causes the knot, and then when you cause pain, that pain essentially drowns out the other pain. If it's sharp enough, it drowns out the other pain. When you take your finger away, they can't feel the other pain for some time, but eventually it comes back when their brain kind of flips back in. So where does that leave us as practitioners if we like to roll on a ball or massage people or whatever? Well, if I've got a sore neck, I massage it because it feels better. But I just don't think I'm fixing anything in the muscle. I don't think I'm undoing knots or adhesions or trigger points. I just know that if I rub on it for 30 seconds, it feels looser for a bit, and then it often comes back again in full force after a couple of hours. And I know that massage is not a long-term, cure or fix or solution for any of these things. It's kind of a short-term feel-good thing, and that for most of these conditions, it's if it's a chronic pain situation, much more contextual in terms of their whole life, things about systemic issues like sleep, stress, negative pain beliefs, passive coping strategies, all of these types of things are probably more important, and physical exercise and physical activity are probably more important than releasing knots in the bit where you feel the pain. So, Tracy, a long and somewhat meandering explanation, but I hope that makes sense. I'm going to attach in the description of this video, under this video, a fantastic paper by Quintner et al. From 2014, which is called A Critical Evaluation of the Trigger Point Phenomenon. And it is a brilliant paper which goes into all of this in much more detail with a lot of citations. Lisa says, hi Raf, would you be able to give advice on the below for clients who are experiencing a sensation of what they've described as flicking of the tendon behind the knee? It's non-painful, and this person is healthy and in her 20s. She's fairly active. She does reformer, mat work, pole 3 to 5 days a week. The sensations only happened recently. Could it be too much too quick? She's been learning new moves in her classes. Could it be that she needs to stretch more, let it rest for a few days? This tends to occur when she's walking up the stairs and usually doing exercises like straight leg kickbacks, donkey kicks, etc. I've been thinking maybe it's load, but I'm unsure. I used to experience this feeling as well, and it went away with Pilates. Well, Lisa, I had a little look on Google Scholar because I didn't know the answer to that, and I'm not a lot wiser now, but I can tell you what I found, which is that is a condition called snapping knee. You know, so you can have, when your hip clicks, that's called snapping hip. You can have snapping shoulder, snapping neck, whatever. And so snapping knee, it's reasonably rare, so there's not a lot of research into it. There are a bunch of descriptions of surgical cases where the snapping comes from various tendons in the knee. Now, you said behind the knee, so I'm going to interpret that to mean the hamstring tendons. Now, the hamstrings are the muscles at the back of your thigh here, and the hamstring tendons, you can feel them in your own knee very, very easily. They're like a steel cable underneath your skin there, directly under your skin. You can feel them very, very easily. And so you have 2 medial hamstrings on the inside of the knee and 1 lateral hamstring. 2 lateral hamstrings with a common tendon. So you've got 1 tendon on the outside and 2 tendons on the inside. And one of the hamstring tendons on the inside also is the tendon for your gracilis, which is an adductor muscle, and also your sartorius, which is one of the hip flexor muscles. So the sartorius, the gracilis, and one of the hamstrings, the semitendinosus, I think, all have a common tendon called the pes anserine, which is means goose's foot. And that inserts about here on the inside front of the tibia. And the other medial hamstring inserts a little bit up higher into the meniscus and to the tibia. And the lateral hamstring inserts into the fibula head and the outside of the tibia. And so what those tendons, what the noise can be is the tendons flicking over as the joint bends, flicking over a bursa, which is like a little pad underneath the tendon that might be a bit irritated, or flicking over the head of the fibula on the outside, which is this little bone on the outside of your knee. There are also some bones, I forget the correct term, but basically like a sesamoid bone, a bone that is within a muscle, that can flick over various things, and not all people have those sesamoid bones. I forget the exact name of the sesamoid bone that is in the hamstring or the popliteus back there, but there is one in about half of people, I believe, and so that can sometimes flick. Now, so those are the potential candidates that could be causing the noise. Now, you said this woman, it only started recently, and she's never had it before. So I would say 2 things that occur to me. The first one seems more likely is, given that she's recently started, increased her activity levels from the sound of things, that her, one of her bursae, which is a little fluid-filled sac that sits between a tendon and the joint, so where the tendon passes over the joint, there's a little bursa, to reduce friction. And if she has increased her activity levels, like done too much too soon, that bursa could potentially have got a bit irritated, a bit inflamed, which would cause it to get bigger. Okay, inflamed. When things are inflamed, they fill with fluid. When it's filled with fluid, it gets bigger. And so now it's bigger. So now the tendon flicks over it. So that's probably what I think would be the most likely explanation. And if that is the cause, then exactly what you suggested, Lisa, of let it rest, not complete rest, but just reduce activity levels enough so it's not irritated, and then do that, maintain that lower level of activity for long enough to let it settle, probably a couple of weeks. Okay, and then gradually build the activity back up and just don't build it up as fast next time. Second possibility, which I think is less likely, so I would try that first one first, reduce the training volume a bit. And specifically just the training volume of those moves, the moves that aggravate it. And then build it back up. And then the second thing, which I think is less likely but still possible, is that as muscles, like she's increased her activity, so maybe her muscles have grown a bit. Your muscles get stronger, that means they get a bit wider. And as the muscle grows, well, where its center is changes, right? Because if the muscle goes wider, well, the center, this edge of the muscle is against the bone, right? So the muscle doesn't get wider like that, it gets wider like that, right? So where the middle of the muscle is, moves. Okay, now the middle of the muscle is where the tendon is. So the tendon moves, right? So when a muscle, if you have a bigger muscle, then the midpoint of the muscle, the tendon is coming from a different angle, right? So, and that might have caused that, but, that seems less plausible to me. And in my head, when I'm thinking about that, it seems like, well, that, if anything, that would probably reduce the amount of flicking because it would move the tendon further away from the center of rotation of the joint. So I'm going to go with theory number one, okay, which is that maybe there's an irritated bursa or some other, structure. Maybe the tendon itself is a bit irritated, and that I would reduce the load, not eliminate the load, but reduce the load a bit, and then let it settle and then build it back up again. Hope that helps. Let me know how you go. Rosa says, "Hi, Raf. Thanks so much for the lecture. There's something I really wanted to ask, but we ran out of time. I realise this is $1 million how long is a piece of string question, but here goes. Do you guys have a bit of a template or a rough guesstimate or estimate or budget sheet or template of costs associated with opening a studio? I totally understand there are so many variables to something like that, similar to buying a house, I guess, but maybe as an average ballpark or at least a list of things to consider in the budget. This is something I'm aspiring to for the mid to long term, but I'm very interested in gathering as much info as I can ahead of time. Thanks in advance, Raf." Well, Rosa, I've opened I've opened 2 of my own studios and also set up our Northcote campus here with a lot of help from my team. And I've been involved in opening 2 studios where I was working for others, and I've also I've been hanging around various people at KX Pilates for a decade or so, and am aware secondhand of a lot of what's involved in setting up those studios. And I've also know a bunch. I've talked to a bunch of graduates who've opened their studios as well. So I would suggest go back and watch. There's a couple episodes on my blog with Laura Saggers at Rise Pilates. I recommend you go watch those. We talk about setting up a studio. Also one with Kat Webb talking about setting up Good Times Pilates. So go watch those. Now here's a off the top of my head list. Well, I guess the first thing I would say is it is how long's a piece of string, and so you get to choose how long the piece of string is to a certain extent. So I would say spend as little as possible. So don't go for gold-plated taps in the bathroom and custom-made, $5,000 light fittings. And the reason I say that is because that's what I did when we opened our first studio in Melbourne CBD. Actually, we had $3,500 light fitting in one of our studios. So don't waste money on stuff that is purely aesthetic. It's been proven again and again and again that you can make an incredibly cool space out of something that is a bit rough with just a bit of care and creativity, and you don't need to spend mega bucks on your decor. Now, I'm not saying don't have great decor. I'm saying don't spend mega bucks. to make your great decor great. So make a virtue of necessity. Go for a sort of New York loft vibe or a distressed cottage vibe or whatever vibe, or a warehouse vibe or whatever. But don't go for a Vogue living vibe unless you can figure out a creative way to do that on, what do they call it? Champagne on a beer budget. So yeah, my first caution is don't just give your architect a blank check and have a real strict budget. I would say you should expect to basically find a place with good bones, by which I mean good natural light, good flooring, exposed brick or nice, walls of some kind, maybe nice something overhead that looks nice, whether it's exposed beams or even like exposed air conditioning, ducting and stuff can look really cool. So basically try and find a place that's going to require the minimum intervention to make it good. Now, if it's got daggy 1990s carpet on the floor, that's fine, but pull up the carpet, look underneath. Are there beautiful floorboards that just need a bit of a polish? Or is there concrete that you could just polish? In which case, you should expect to basically carpet / polishing floorboards, erect a few stud walls, to separate out the reception area from the studio area, couple of mirrors. You're probably going to have to do something basic to the bathrooms, and a couple of coats of paint and a sign out the front. So I'm going to say that should, cost you, guesstimate, 40,000, 30,000, something like that. Then you're going to need, and that's if you budget hard on that. So be stingy. Then you're going to need a lease, and you're going to pay a lease bond. So you probably need to pay somewhere between 3 and 6 months bond, rent as bond. So you need to pay probably 3 months rent up front, or first and last months, probably 3 months rent up front, plus another 3 to 6 months rent as bond. And so that is pretty significant. I can't tell you exactly what the commercial rents are going to be around your area, but don't choose a retail space that's on ground level unless it's a really good deal. I would choose one up on the first floor probably, as long as it's got its own street frontage, like a discrete entrance, because it's way cheaper if you get it on the first floor instead of ground level retail. At Northcote we pay something like $65,000 a year, and that's for 300 square metres, so you won't need that much, but you'll be probably in a more high traffic area than we are, because passing trade is important for you, where it's not for us. So, that probably sounds roughly kind of sort of about the ballpark of rent that you should be paying. Might be plus or minus $20,000 though, depending on which part of Australia you're in and which part of the city you're in, or town or whatever. And so then you need to pay that. Then you'll need to have equipment, and I would recommend you lease reformers. Even if you have the cash to buy them, I would recommend you lease them. So that is, you basically get a loan. You put down 20% or whatever of the cash, and then you borrow the rest and pay that off over time and use the reformers as security for that. And reformers are, you can buy Allegro 2s, the sexy ones, for $6,500 each, or you can buy, Pilates health equipment ones that we have at Northcote. I think are freaking awesome, and they're like $3,500 each, or they were when we bought them. And if you're buying 12 or 14 of those suckers, like that extra $3,000 makes a big difference to your bottom line. So I would seriously consider buying a better value equipment rather than going for the Vogue Living one, because honestly, in my experience, clients don't care. They just want something good. Once it's good, they don't even notice it. They don't even see it. As long as it works well and it's robust, you definitely want solid commercial equipment that functions. And the reason I would lease that is that even if you have the money, leasing it means you can keep the money in case you need it. Then you're going to need, a few things like, website, booking system, Merchant Gateway, stuff like that. All of that's pretty cheap. I wouldn't spend mega bucks on that. I would, preferably get a DIY website in WordPress or Wix or Squarespace or something and just drag and drop it yourself. I would either just get a friend to take some photos on her iPhone or, even better, DSLR camera, or just go to like shutterstock.com and get some photos. I wouldn't pay a professional photographer and get models and all of that because, again, people won't notice it. I honestly think like these are kind of just vanity things that people do. It's like, yeah, everyone wants it to look beautiful, but it's been shown abundantly that in many industries that looking beautiful doesn't equal an effective website that delivers clients to your business. Like look at Amazon, but ugly does like $20 billion a week in sales or something ridiculous. It doesn't have to look incredibly beautiful to be effective. So it needs to be effective, but you don't need to spend $10,000 on a photo shoot to have it looking good enough to do the job. You need to, something to save yourself money is please check your council permit status before you sign a lease. Do not sign a lease until you've checked with the council and had written by the council and signed by a specific person at the council, confirmation of the permit status or zoning status for that premises that you can run commercial Pilates classes there. If you don't have that permit yet and you have to apply for a permit, that process can take a day. No, it won't take a day. It could take a month, could take 6 months. At Northcote, it took us 15 months to get our council permit. And we didn't do any major renovations. We literally pulled out some old carpet and put in new carpet. We repainted the walls and we changed it from an industrial warehouse to an education facility. And that took us 15 months and cost us like 20 grand in actual fees, plus 15 months of not trading. So don't make the same mistake I made and check your council permit before you sign a lease. Do not, under any circumstances, sign a lease if you don't yet have council approval to operate a Pilates business in that premises. Then you'll need, what else do you need? You need some marketing collateral, a logo, a business name, some fonts and all that. Don't go and spend $10,000 at, Acme graphic design firm. Just get someone on Upwork to do it for you for $100. Like, just get yourself a cheap logo, get yourself some cheap brand colours and fonts and things. Don't spend mega bucks on it. At this stage, that's not going to be the make or break thing for your business. Then you'll need to hire staff, and so you'll need a lawyer. You'll need someone to draw up contracts for your staff and things. You'll need an accountant, someone to make sure that you're paying your PAYG tax and superannuation and all that stuff, and a bookkeeper. And so you'll need to pay your staff while you first operate before you break even. And there's a whole nother conversation about how do you market the business and whatever, but so that you don't have to operate for long before you break even. But I would say that what's that, 30-40 grand for renovations plus what, 7.5 for 3 months rent in advance, and another, let's call it another 15 for 6 months rent. So as bond, so what's that, 22.5 plus 40 is 62.50 plus 20% of 412s is $48,000 worth of reformers. If you buy 12 at $4,000 each, so you'd be paying like 12,000 as deposit for those, 10,000 as deposit for those. So what's already up to 92,000. Then we're up to websites, marketing collateral, some computers and furniture, called 150 $140,000. That would be my guesstimate. 130, 140,000. That's if you lease the equipment. That's if you scrimp and save on the renovation and don't go overboard on the logo design, website design, etc. How much could you spend? You could spend $5 million, quite easily. I opened a club that spent $5 million. Not mine. I was working for somebody. We spent $360,000 in 2006 when we opened Breathe Wellbeing. And then in 2016, when we opened Northcote campus, we spent about a quarter of that. So we learned our lesson. Yeah, so I hope that helps, Rosa. Cherie says, hey, Raf, thanks for the opportunity to ask you anything. I'm gaining a lot from these videos. I've had a prospective client approach me who was diagnosed with retrolisthesis throughout her entire lumbar spine, plus nerve compression between L5 and S1. Her physio, or EP, has been working with her for 8 weeks on a very specific plan to strengthen glutes, shoulders, core and upper back, aiming to stabilise and reduce the load on the lower back. He has also worked on all biomechanics and ergonomics, e.g. pelvic alignment. She has a brace to wear. She tapes for certain exercises. Her car seat has been changed along with her client's cot height, etc. There was no trauma. Her physio explained to her the cause being most likely gradual changes by a combination of running history and 2 pregnancies close together. I don't know much about this condition. Is there anything that can help me guide her towards the best rehab? Is there any evidence to say that treatment for this condition should be different to any other lower back condition pending no red flags? Thanks for considering my question. Hope you're doing well. Thinking of you all. Thanks, Cherie. I hope you're doing well. We're awesome. And I hope you're doing well over there. And thanks for your question. Well, retrolisthesis, let's have a look. If you have your vertebra here and your adjacent vertebra, there'd be a little facet joint in there. There, and then of course you've got your disc in there. Well, a retrolisthesis is where one vertebra, the top one slips backward or the bottom one slips forward, whichever way you want to think about it. Let's think about it like the top one slipping backward. So that's called a retro, when that one goes forwards, retrolisthesis. Retro, meaning backwards, listhesis. And so what can be the problem there is, of course, that your neural your spinal nerves go down through this area here, and they're actually not outside the vertebra like that. It's kind of a super clumsy drawing there, but they're surrounded by a canal there. And if that shifts backwards far enough, let's shift it backwards this time, eh? If that shifts backwards far enough, well, that can cause some compression. There we go. It could cause some compression, or kinking would be another way of thinking of it, of that spinal nerve. And that spinal nerve then can, send pain signals. Well, there's no such thing as a pain signal, but it can generate weird sensations, which you can interpret as pain, or it could, prevent the signal to muscles, or you could get what's called paresthesia, which is like a tingling sensation, like when your arm goes to sleep, when you sleep on it. So that's the basic plan with retrolisthesis, or that's the basic explanation of what retrolisthesis is. It's very rare from what I could gather with a Google Scholar search. And the first thing I looked up was, what's the natural history? Excuse me. So in other words, if we do nothing, what's the outcome? It turns out that retrolisthesis, the outcomes are pretty good, and particularly with paresthesia. So if she has now, here's the thing. Let me back up a step. So the problem the problem with having retrolisthesis is that potentially you can kink or irritate the spinal nerve. So if it doesn't kink or irritate the spinal nerve, it's not a problem. Like, the only problem is irritation of the spinal nerve and, pain signals down the leg or loss of muscle strength in the leg. So if there's no pain and no loss of control and no weird sensations in the leg, I would say treat her in all respects like a completely normal person and forget about the retrolisthesis and just do all over body strengthening, stretching and all those normal good things. If she does have pain in her back and in her leg, or weird sensations in her leg, like, tingling, numbness, heat, cold, feeling of wetness, weird sensations in the leg, that are exacerbated by certain positions, then you need to modify a little bit. So typically when you, let me get out my spine. So here are the vertebral bodies. There's the L1 or something, and there's the L2, and here is the spinal nerve that comes out in between those two, and it comes out through this hole called the neural foramen. The neural foramen is the gap in between two vertebrae where the spinal nerves exit. Now, as we bend the spine backwards, as we extend the spine, you should be able to see that the neural foramen gets smaller. Actually, this one's a bit twisted here. The neural foramen gets smaller. Can you see that the gaps where those little yellow bits of plastic come out of the spine get smaller as it bends backwards and bigger as it bends forwards? Smaller as it bends backwards, bigger as it bends forwards. So if you've got a situation where somebody already has some kind of, irritation or, reduced gap for the nerve there, and then you bend backwards, well, that could potentially, squish the nerve, irritate the nerve. And so what would happen in that situation is, when she bends backwards, she would either get symptoms in her leg, or if she already had symptoms in her leg, they would get worse. So, and that would tell you that her retrolisthesis combined with backbending is now, narrowing that neural canal or the neural foramen enough that the nerve is being impinged, bumped into, squished. And so in that case, if you backbend with her, if she backbends and she gets pain or symptoms in her leg of some kind, well, that would suggest that probably backbending is not a good plan. If she backbends a little bit and it's fine, and she backbends extreme amounts and that gives her symptoms in her leg, well, backbend a little bit, but don't backbend extreme amounts. If she can backbend with no symptoms in her leg, fine, just backbend, go for it. It means that, okay, her retrolisthesis is quite mild and not a problem. So it's only a problem if it's a problem, right? If there's no symptoms from it, it's not a problem. So, and the symptoms that you would be worried about would be, or looking out for, would be stuff down the leg, stuff into the bum, down the back of the thigh, into the calf and into the foot, any combination of that. And it could be pain, it could be burning, it could be tingling, it could be numbness, it could be loss of sensation, it could be weakness, it could any combination of sensations. If it is aggravated by backbending, that probably suggests that the retrolisthesis is significant enough that backbending is not a good idea, and you should just do normal strengthening and stretching, but just leave out the backbending. So strengthen her back, but just don't bend her backwards. But if, on the other hand, she can bend backwards without creating leg symptoms, don't worry about it. Just treat her like a normal person. Now, if she gets a bit of back pain when she bends backwards, don't worry about that. That's normal. Who doesn't get a bit of back pain when they bend backwards? I know I do. It's completely normal. Everybody feels a bit stiff in their back when they bend backwards. Well, not everybody. Maybe Cirque du Soleil acrobats don't, but pretty much everybody who's a normal human gets a bit of discomfort in their back when they bend backwards. So don't worry about that. And because remember, in retrolisthesis, what we're concerned about is the nerve being impinged. Okay. And if the nerve is impinged in the lower back, it's not going to cause pain in the lower back. It's going to cause pain in the leg. So if she's got pain in the lower back, that's fine. That's good. Not a problem. If she's got pain in the leg on backbending, or that is aggravated by backbending, leave out the backbending. Hope that helps. Last one, which is from Kim Hanley. Kim says, "Hey Raf, so good to see your face. How are things in the world of Pilates and COVID? Things are awesome in my Pilates and COVID world, Kim, and I hope you're keeping well. Great to hear from you. Here's a loaded question. How do you know when you're training too hard for your body or central nervous system, apart from fatigue, because that can be deceiving? Thanks, Kim." Well, so essentially, Kim, if you're training, well, here's how I think about it. In order for your training to work, for you to get stronger, essentially, I'm assuming that you're thinking about strength training, although this applies to cardio training as well. For you to get stronger, you need to do two things. You need to have a sufficient training stimulus, enough training, enough and hard enough training to stimulate your body to get stronger. And then you need to have sufficient recovery, and that is enough time and nutrition for your body to get stronger. And if you increase the dose of strength training or cardio or whatever, then you require better recovery. So if you do more sets of squats, you need, more protein, more calories, more sleep, more time to recover than if you do fewer sets of squats. And so if you train more and more and more, what you'll find is, in general, there's what's called a dose-response relationship between training volume and strength improvement, or hypertrophy, if, muscle growth, if that's what you're going for. They both kind of work pretty closely together. So in general, as a rule of thumb, more training volume equals more gains, assuming adequate recovery. So if you, so number one, if you're getting gains, you don't need to train more. If you're not getting gains, there are two possible reasons. One is not enough stimulus, or the other one would be not enough recovery, right? Now, if you're training, now I know you, Kim, I know enough about you to be pretty certain that if you're training it and you're not getting gains, it's not because you're not training enough. I'm pretty confident about that from what I know about you. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say, let's back up a step. If you're training, even if you're not Kim, right? If you're training and you're not getting gains, like you're not getting stronger. How do you know if you're getting stronger? Well, you can put more weight on the bar, you can put more springs on the reformer, you can do more squats, you can do more push-ups, whatever it might be. You're getting measurably better. Not just feeling stronger, but actually measurably more weight on the bar, or you did 3 more push-ups today than you did last week, or whatever. So if you're getting stronger, yay, you're winning. Don't change anything. Just keep doing what you're doing. If you're not getting stronger, you either have to increase the stimulus, more training, or you have to increase the recovery. Now, if you're training, you probably have a reasonable sense of this. If you're doing 2 sessions a week and you're doing 1 set of push-ups, each session, and you're not getting results, well, you're probably not overtraining. So probably just do more and you'll get your results. Whereas if you're doing push-ups 4 days a week and you're doing 8 sets to failure every single time and you're not getting gains, well, you're probably not undertraining. You're probably overtraining. So those are the two options, right? If you're not getting stronger, that tells you you're overtraining. Well, if you're not getting stronger and you're not undertraining, it tells you that you're overtraining, right? And now overtraining, I don't really actually like that word. You're not recovering enough, okay? So I'm a massive advocate of doing more, right? More training, better, awesome. More and more, better and better, if that's your thing. If you want to get stronger, there's not really much substitute for just training more. But you need to be able to tolerate that training load. And the way you can tell if you're tolerating it is, are you getting stronger? So when you come into the gym, I wouldn't, think about am I feeling energetic today? No, I agree with you. That's not a good measure. Pick up a bar, see how much you can lift. If you can lift less than you could last time, you're not recovered yet. Okay? Don't train. If you just not getting stronger, over time, and if you're doing a relatively high volume, then it's probably the case that you're not recovering enough. And so to increase your recovery, you can do a couple of, 2 basic things. One, you can actively increase your recovery. Or the second one is you can decrease your training stimulus. Okay, so the first one I would look at is can you actively increase your recovery? So now I'm sure you're all over this, Kim, but you need, if you want to get stronger, you need to be in a caloric surplus, right? So that is do not pass go, do not collect $200, get in a caloric surplus. If you want to build muscle, you have to build it out of something, so you have to have calories to build it out of. Number 2 is you have to have adequate protein intake. And again, Kim, I know you're all over this, but I'm going to mention it for everyone else. A few recent systematic reviews have concluded that up to 2 grams per kilo of body weight per day, if you increase up to that point, you keep getting more and more and more gains, better recovery. So if you're not having 2 grams per kilo of your body weight per day of protein, increase your protein intake and go see a dietitian and they'll give you a specific number of grams. But basically, if you're a 50 kilo human, eat 100 grams of protein a day. Pretty simple. Now, if you're sort of over 40, you might need more, even more, because as you age, you don't absorb protein as well as, as you utilize it as you used to. So if you're in your golden years, shall we say, you might need even more than 2 grams per day. That's why you should go see a dietitian. Then sleep, you need, they say 7 to 8, for the average person, but if you're doing heavy training, probably more like 8 to 9 hours a night of sleep. And the best way to get more sleep is spend more time in bed. And if you're doing all of those things, and of course you need to make sure that your vitamins and macronutrients are okay. So, if you're not outside a lot or if you live anywhere in Melbourne, you need to be taking vitamin D supplement. Again, go see a dietitian. They'll sort out all of that for you. And Kim, in your case, I know you've already done that. So if you're in a caloric surplus, you're having adequate protein, you're having adequate sleep, and your vitamins and macronutrients are, on point, and you're still not getting stronger, you're overtraining. In which case, just back it off a bit. So for upper body, I've seen a couple of studies that suggested that a maximum of 10 sets per body part per week is optimal, and more than that doesn't give you more gains. Whereas for lower body, it seems to be up to 20 sets. That's as far as we've studied, as far as I can tell. More is better. So, yeah, hope that helps. Oh, the third thing is, the final little sub point to that last bit is when reducing your training volume, if you do decide to do such, you can reduce it by just training a bit further from failure. Now, there's pretty strong research that are pointing to the fact that training further from failure gives better gains. Now, for hypertrophy, it's about equal, probably very slightly better training further from failure. Whereas for strength, it's significantly better to train further from failure. So I've got a velocity sensor on my barbell, and I stop when I hit a 10% reduction in velocity. So that's not a lot, right? So if I'm doing, say, my 5 rep max, I might get out 3 reps. Or even more, if I'm doing my 6 rep max, I might get out 3 reps. So it's really, it's nowhere near failure. 2 or 3 or 4 reps from failure if you're in that kind of 85% plus of your 1RM. If you're doing like a moderate load, like if you're doing something like 15 reps to failure, probably 10 reps, you'll hit a 10% velocity loss. So that would be another thing. So short of buying a velocity sensor, it's basically the first rep where you feel yourself just slightly slow down, that's when you stop. And that will decrease your exercise-induced muscle damage and decrease your the muscle protein synthesis that is required for repair, and allow your muscle protein synthesis to be applied to hypertrophy rather than repair. So anyway, I hope that helps. The basic gist is train more is good. More training equals more gains, but you have to train and you have to recover. And both of those things are equally important. And if you don't have both of them, you don't get gains. If you're not training much and you're not getting gains, probably train more. If you're training heaps and you're not getting gains, check your recovery. Make sure you have adequate caloric surplus. 2 grams of protein per kilo of body weight per day or more. If you're older, go see a dietitian. Make sure you're getting enough vitamins, particularly vitamin D, and make sure you're getting enough sleep, 8 to 9 hours a night. And if you're getting all of those things and you're still not getting gains and you're training heaps, train a bit further away from failure. And if you're still not getting gains and you're training heaps, do less. Now, there are several other questions that I couldn't get to today because there were just heaps of questions this week. So my apologies if you were in that category, and I will get to your questions next week, I promise. But I only have a certain amount of time in the day to spend on this, and I've reached my limit. It's not just the recording actually that takes the time. There's a couple of hours of research or even more that goes into coming up with these supposedly glib answers. Thank you for your patience, and thank you all for your questions. I hope you're well. Hope your loved ones are well, and I hope you're enjoying life these last few precious days of winter. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.